The opinions expressed in the following video are not in their entirety endorsed by this podcast. They are instead the focus of our discussion today. This is your content warning.
So I have a question for my brothers in Christ, and I've been kind of wondering this for a while, but I really want to hear what you guys have to say on this. I think it's pretty apparent that masculinity has been very demonized in society today. Men are often accused of being toxic and evil and bad for being masculine, for having God-given natural masculine characteristics. Unfortunately, I feel this has spread into the church and it's kind of infected the church as well. That's just my own experience. Yours might be different. As a single Christian female who would love to be married to a man of the Lord someday, I find that when I go to church, it's pretty dry as far as like young, masculine, strong, independent men go. Do you feel that the church has emasculated you as men?
Joshua, good morning.
What's up, dude?
Dude, is it as nice where you are as it is where I am right now?
It wasn't this morning. This morning it was storming and lightning and
Oh, snap.
all kinds of crazy stuff. But
Well,
yeah, right now it's not bad. A little cloudy, but
I was
not
about to say,
terrible.
I don't know that you can tell super much behind me, but it's a little cloudy, but it feels fantastic considering what the weather's been like over the last few weeks. But man, I'm excited to get going this morning. We've got a great
Me
topic.
too.
Awesome conversation to take place. Guys, welcome back to your Content Warning podcast, a Bible Meets Culture podcast where we break down biblical content versus modern theology. And Joshua, I'm not going to lie, when I found this video, the very first person that popped into my head was our guest today. Wayne Jones is on the podcast with us today. Super excited to have him on. Joshua, as we often do, we look for vastly overqualified individuals to be on here with us so that they can be the smart guy in the room. And Wayne, we are incredibly thankful to have you on. Wayne is a professor and dean of students at the Bear Valley Bible Institute in Denver, Colorado. So the weather where he is way nicer than where we are.
Absolutely.
About 90% of the time anyway. The 4 feet of snow on occasion I could do without, but right now I bet it's absolutely gorgeous. But Wayne is a professor at Bear Valley. He also is the host of the Authentically Adam podcast, which is produced by the Light Network, which is a great resource. If you like this podcast, you'll absolutely find something over at thelightnetwork.tv that you could be a part of. But I've been a fan of Authentically Adam for a while. And so when this conversation came up, when I found this video, Joshua and I decided we wanted to talk about this. Wayne, you were honestly the first guy that came to mind. I was like, this is kind of what he does anyway. And so I'd thank you so much for being on, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Well, I'm still looking for the guy that's overqualified for this because you didn't pick the right dude for that. But anyway, I'll give what I can. So,
well, we appreciate you giving us some of your time and thoughts. And so we just want to jump right into it. If you've already seen or heard this video before, listening to this, you'll know that we're having a conversation about masculinity. Essentially, is kind of what this boils down to. And I do want to make one quick clarification because I kind of had myself wondering. It's nice, Joshua. We talk about this a lot with these TikTok videos, how we get a lot of stuff out of context. But she actually made a clarification video that kind of followed up to this. And she wanted to be sure that we understood that the clarification was, and maybe you understood this the way that she meant it anyway, but she's not saying that the church is what makes you toxic as a man, right? She's not saying that toxic masculinity is something that is caused by the church. The issue that she's running into, that she says, is that because of the cultural acceptance of toxic masculinity, that has crept its way into the church and has caused the issue of that the church doesn't teach biblical masculinity because they maybe are too worried about coming off as toxic or damaging. Joshua, we've had Wayne, you'll appreciate this. Maybe we've had Denny Petrillo on as well to talk about, the differences in the roles that men and women have within the church. And I think that plays kind of maybe goes hand in hand with a lot of what we see in church culture today. And so we'll talk a little bit about maybe a couple of other problems that she alludes to down the line. But I want to be sure that we clarify, we don't get too far off the actual conversation of the church doesn't cause toxic masculinity, but maybe what she's saying is the church hasn't had the best response to the culture of toxic masculinity either. So is that fair or unfair assessment?
Yeah, I think it is. In fact, I was, putting some notes together and preparing for this discussion. And my first thought was that I wouldn't blame the church. I would blame society. And if I was going to put a blame anywhere else, it would be on the home for not correcting that. But the church is certainly always a reflection of the culture around it, always. And so if the culture is going that way, the church is going to have to deal with it. And quite frankly, we end up playing catch up most of the time. We don't take the lead. We look at the issues of race and gender dysphoria and a lot of that stuff. The church is almost reactionary to that, and because of that, we tend to put the blame on the church when that's not fair. But if we had done a better job leading the way, maybe we could have cut some of this off in our homes connected to the church, and there could have been a major difference. So again, wouldn't blame the church, but I would agree that the church embraces society and therefore is usually behind the curve on trying to correct it or especially be ahead of it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I like what you said about the church being reactionary. I think that's, in a sense, unfortunate because we're to be the light and the salt. We're to set the way. But I feel like the church reacts and is reactionary a lot because when topics come up, we talk about them and we talk about the topics people care about, which gets people listening and looking, and we kind of use that as a doorway. And so, in a sense, it's a good thing. In a sense, it's not. But one thing that I thought about the video too that seems to be sort of the motivation behind the video is this young lady is looking for a husband or looking for a dating partner, and she has particular criteria that are not being met by young men or younger men in the church. I'm seeing that in youth groups all over or in young adult groups all over, especially in our brotherhood. They're our group right now. We have young men in our group, and I don't want to talk about our group exclusively, but we have far more young ladies in our group than young men, and that may or may not be the case for most young adult or youth groups. And you want your young people, whether that be young adults or youth groups, to go after someone who's godly, go after someone who's going to be a leader in the household. And what Wayne said about the home being the place that really needs to be corrective in this. I do a lot of premarital counseling, and the number one challenge that I have in premarital counseling is getting these young ladies to realize they are not the head of the household.
Right.
And I don't want that to sound cruel or old fashioned in any way. Our young ladies certainly have a place in the marriage relationship, a very special place that the men do not have. But that's a hard thing. I do think we are emasculating the role of a man, but we are masculizing or whatever word you want to use there. I think I made that word up. Our young ladies, and that's not biblical either.
Yeah,
Right.
it's not always the appropriate response, right? Is we talk a lot about that swinging pendulum, about how maybe for a long time there were some unhealthy attributes that came from men specifically within the church, and there was a group that said that's not what biblical masculinity looks like, and so I'm gonna stutter over that repeatedly today. By the way, biblical masculinity. But we had a group that said that's not what that looks like, and I think over the course of time and what you're seeing probably now in 2024 is that pendulum going so far the other direction,
Right.
in the sense that roles are just kind of there as guidelines, but maybe we've put too stringent limitations on gender ideology in the church anyway.
Well, it's, Josh just mentioned, to emasculate men is to empower women because somebody's going to step into that void.
Yes.
Somebody's going to lead. And I don't think we can appreciate that until, again, you see that play out. So you take men out of that role, you make them timid and shy to step up and lead. Somebody's going to lead. There's going to be a leader in a group. And quite frankly, a lot of times women have a lot more assertiveness and wanted to take charge just by their motherly instinct and just to take charge mentality they have to have in certain areas of life. And, given that opening, when that void, they're going to step in. So, the church needs to empower men and young men to learn to lead and be masculine, so that it cuts off that temptation in the women to overstep.
Sure. So let's start with this, because she does make the claim, right? And she says that it's a very obvious claim. And so I just want to, for the sake of being as transparent as possible, if it's obvious, it's obvious. And if it's not, then maybe we can have that conversation. But she makes the claim that culture, she doesn't think there's any question about it, demonizes this idea of masculinity. Is that true or false from y'all's perspective?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know that society as a whole does. I think the sound bites we hear, the tweets that are sent out, the what makes the news cycle certainly highlights that. I mean, when you're part of regular people and regular culture and day to day small town life, whatever, I think you see that people still appreciate masculinity from a biblical or semi biblical perspective. But what the world reports and what we hear is constantly, this is too far, this is too much, and so I think as a whole, what you hear from society is men have far too long overstepped their bounds and they need to take a step back. And that is, whether you want to put it that way, that's demonizing. That's making a man feel less than godly or moral or courageous for taking the role that God gave him to give. And so no one wants to be thought of that way. So I'll take a step back. And
Yeah.
I think that's certainly true.
I think that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And what that tends to mean for me is there was a time in our, what would you say, the Me Too movement, where men were certainly being demonized for whatever reason. And then the equal and opposite reaction is to take men that are now being labeled as the red pill men that say we're going to be the ultimate picture of what masculine. I'm not thinking biblical masculinity here in this case, but
Sure.
what masculinity culturally is. And that means that I can do what I want when I want and say what I want and be what I want, and work out at the gym 12 times a day and be with all these beautiful ladies all at the same time. And that's a problem too. And so the question for us might be, okay, here's what culture is saying. It depends on what the culture is. It depends on what culture you're part of. And now with the rise of social media and algorithms give you what you want, right? That's the problem of social media. And so if you're part of the all men are monsters group, you're going to be fed that in your culture. If you're part of the all men are God's gift to everyone and anyone else who's not a man is the devil and awful, you're going to be part of that culture.
Sure.
And in both cases, both of those obviously have their problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to be sure that we're fair to both sides here, because I think that you said something that's maybe a key there, Joshua, is you have this, of course, and there are some that would label what we're doing right now as toxic masculinity. It's
Sure.
three middle-aged white men who are sitting in a room talking about how it's okay to be a man. That's deemed to be toxic in a lot of ways. But I think that you made a kind of a key clarification, in the sense that culture does demonize a lot of what masculinity is. But I think that there is something to be said for, I think there are aspects of biblical masculinity that are demonized, but I think that there are also parts of it that are really cherished. Ironically, as I was getting ready for this particular podcast, I found a video of a young lady, and I say young, probably mid-20s. She was a younger lady who was talking about how she broke her only rule, and that she went on a date with a guy who she thought was masculine. Like, he pulled up in a pickup truck and got out wearing a camo shirt. And I mean, and she said, and all of a sudden he was opening the door for me and he was paying for my meal. And she's like, and all of a sudden I thought, like, she's like, I could, she said it scared her. She's like, I felt the feminism kind of leave my body for a minute. Like, it was attractive to her. Some of these characteristics that, at least as a young Christian man, I was taught were supposed to be normal. And so I do want to be fair to both sides here, because I do think that there is some of what culture demonizes that maybe has been warranted. that we've seen, and even warranted from those that wear the name of Christ, that we've seen people take biblical masculinity and twist it into something that, maybe using a hot button word here, but has turned it into something that is abusive and oppressive, and they've taken some of that authority that God has given them, and maybe they've overstepped it and they've used it in a very unhealthy way. And so I don't want to make light of that. I think that that's been an issue, but I think that, Joshua, as you were kind of saying, the response to that has been to get rid of all of it. And I don't think that's the correct response either. And so I just want to be sure, being fair to both sides here, that I think there absolutely has been an issue of that in the past. But I do think there are characteristics of masculinity that deep down, I think most people really do appreciate. And so, I don't want to make light of that, but I think you're right, Joshua, to the extent where what we want to find in culture today, specifically, what we want to find is what we're going to find, what we're constantly going to be fed. I heard a preacher recently talk about how just go listen to the other news source. He didn't even have to say which one was the other, because everybody in their mind understands what the other one is. But just go. I mean, listen to somebody who thinks a little bit differently than you every once in a while might actually be a good thing for you. And I think that that's something, especially in this conversation, that we just don't see a lot of anymore.
Right.
So if this is kind of the problem that we see, I think that we'll get to another problem here in a minute, but I think that there is one big clarification that we need to make. If there are aspects of toxic masculinity that culture wants to demonize, but there are other aspects of it that maybe we do genuinely appreciate. I think one of the big things that we need to do is to define biblical masculinity. And I know that that might be a really tall task for this short amount of time that we're here. In fact, Wayne has an entire podcast that has been going on for 7 seasons now or something like
We're
that.
in season 9 now.
Yeah. So and he's still currently defining it.
Yep.
So give me, I guess, 9 seasons worth of abridged material. Maybe how do we define what biblical masculinity is?
Obviously, with the title of my podcast being Authentically Adam, I believe the root always goes back to creation, and I think you can see in the early interactions that God had with Adam, that Adam had with Eve, at least 6 traits of biblical masculinity. And I'll just kind of just summarize these. I think it starts with spirituality. There's a relationship with God, and that is the most masculine thing we can do or be, is have a deep and abiding relationship with God, a daily conversation. And you see that in the garden. You don't see any barrier, even when sin enters the picture. You see God coming right back in, having a conversation with Adam through it all. Spirituality, spiritual connection is number one. The idea of dominance and dominion and sovereignty is masculine. God gave man dominion over creation. And again, I think that's the tension in this discussion, because that is biblical, but it's not popular. And so I think that's the heart of why the struggle is there. So you have dominance, you have industry, man being given to the responsibility to dress the garden, keep it and tend it. Even when the fall comes, man still works the ground. It just becomes a little bit harder. So there's industry that's part of masculinity, having a job. And I know that the lady in the video talks about having finding a hardworking man, someone who's committed to doing, she didn't say it, but the implication was manual labor. I think that's part of masculinity in Scripture. Being protective, being a protector. God brings Eve to Adam and gives him to her. I don't think that's about rule as much as it is about protection and watching over. Biblical masculinity is sexual. They became one, and I have a really, really big issue with the way the church, if you want to talk about demonizing the sexual appetite of men, and that emasculates them. You're not supposed to feel that. You're not supposed to think that anyway. And then the final one is submission. So it starts spiritual and ends spiritual. And I think you put those 6 things together, and that's what God created Adam to be. And if we will model that, then we will be biblically masculine. But every step along the way, there is some issue with one of those 6 things in our current world, which makes that issue seem toxic when it's actually biblical.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And every one of those could be a season of podcasts to flesh out, and probably more.
Yep.
The only thing that I could add to that, and it's not even a good addition, but since we're on the podcast, I feel like I have to say something. I think you get a great example of the transition of biblical masculinity with two characters in the book of Judges, and they come one right after the other. And so the first is Samson. Samson seems to have everything he needs to be a biblical masculine man. He has strength, he has leadership, he's put in that position, he has rules that he's to follow, he has people he's to protect, and he violates all of those. And so, in my opinion, from a literary perspective, Samson is very much the toxic masculine figure in the Bible. He has everything that he needs to be a godly man and then squanders it. And then the next example comes almost right after Samson, and that's Gideon. Gideon is hiding in a wine press. He's threshing wheat in a wine press, which for our non-agricultural listeners, you don't thresh wheat in a wine press, you press wine in a wine press. So he's hiding. That is not a picture of masculinity. A picture of masculinity is someone who meets the challenges head on for what they're worth and evaluates them and works through them. And then God calls him to be a leader, to face difficult challenges with a minority of resources, with few resources, but God's in the mix. And when Gideon does that, he's successful. So there you have two examples of one being the masculine picture moving to toxicity, let's say, and then the other, I would argue, is even in some sense feminine, if we're talking about genderization of characters, moving into what true biblical masculinity looks like. So I like the comparison and contrast of those two characters. Maybe you guys can have more to say about it.
Well, no, you stole mine, Joshua, because as much as we like to define what biblical masculinity is, and I think there's a lot of places throughout Scripture you can do that, one of my biggest pet peeves, really from the time I was probably, I would say probably around the time I was 18, 19, somebody asked me, a buddy of mine asked me, hey, why do we think Samson is the man's man of the Bible? And I was like, because he's strong. He's like, yeah, but what else? I was like, I really don't know. And so like it started bugging me that like every time, not to throw any sort of VBS under the bus by any stretch of the imagination, but we love to kind of make celebrity out of the VBS version of Samson.
Right.
You know, he was this strong dude who overcame all these obstacles, and you know, at the end of his life, he was granted strength from God just one more time, and we kind of gloss over the fact that if we're being blunt, Samson was kind of a terrible dude in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, I never quite understood why the disrespectful womanizer was the pinnacle of biblical masculinity. So Joshua, I love that's the example that kind of came to mind, because that's always bugged me in a sense. And I think that a lot of what culture dislikes is a lot of the characteristics that Samson put off. But I think it brings up a good point that you can have a lot of the same characteristics, maybe not the strength necessarily from Samson's perspective, but you can have a lot of the same characteristics and use them appropriately.
Yeah.
And that can be something that is wonderful and is healthy and is done by design, versus maybe allowing a little bit of arrogance and pride get in the way, and then all of a sudden you have an issue, which, you know, maybe a whole nother conversation about what is and isn't. But
well, you're mentioning those two examples and how we pervert them, which I think again lends to the church's fault if we're talking about what the church has done to aid this. I was actually taking a graduate class in just teaching strategies, how to lead a Bible class, and I picked to study from and talk about David and Bathsheba, only because I had been studying it and writing on it anyway, so I was trying to double up. But I got a rude awakening from a professor at Ambridge about it, because he said that in our current culture, if we don't acknowledge when we teach that David went after another man's wife and in essence forced her into his bedroom, that if we don't acknowledge that in the culture that we live in, we look like we're ignoring the issue. He said he's actually gotten to where he in a mixed assembly and would not teach that topic, that text, because of how it triggered the response of the Me Too movement, things like that. When we don't acknowledge, we say David sinned with Bathsheba. We don't say that David in essence raped Bathsheba. And and abused the power he had. In fact, you look through that text and it talks about David sending and calling. David's in charge of that whole thing. And he's abusing that dominant power that God gave him as king over Israel for sexual proclivity and fulfillment. And it was a textbook case of toxic masculinity. And yet, because we want to not be woke and culture oriented in our preaching, we shy away from pointing that out. And I think that lends to the issue that the church is aiding the problem by not highlighting the issues of Samson, the issues of David and other men in Scripture.
Yeah.
And to that point, this is something interesting to bring out with that David narrative in 2 Samuel 11. When he sins for Bathsheba, we don't get the name of the servant, I don't believe, but the servant says, David says, "Who is that?" And the servant says, "This is someone's wife and someone's daughter." And I think part of biblical masculinity, as we're talking about it, is not just realizing who we are in the Lord as an image bearer of God, but realizing who everyone else is. When you realize that, especially women as men, we have a way that we are supposed to treat and love and respect women in whatever context that is in. Children are also part of that. Men should have a love and respect for children. I've said it on the podcast before. I believe everybody needs a church granddaddy, which means that your relationship with that older person, that older man in your church, needs to be defined in a biblical masculine way of nurture and training, and not in an abuse of power in any sense. But I've always loved that about the David story. He says, "Who is that?" And he's met with this someone's wife and someone's daughter, both of which David violates.
Yeah. I had a preacher one time say that one of the greatest indicators of masculinity, one of the greatest indicators of manhood, was understanding your authority and choosing when not to use it. Which I think David doesn't do that, right? I mean, David sees what he wants and he takes it because he had the authority to do so. But I think it brings up to light kind of maybe another issue. One of the issues that she talks about specifically in this video is we're constantly trying to walk that line of we don't want to appear woke, but we also don't want to overly highlight the problems, and it leads to this idea of a culture where men that she talks about that men seemingly feel either emasculated or attacked, and so the solution, at least what I've perceived. Okay, so because Joshua, I can completely relate to you when you were talking earlier about the differential between girls and guys. As a guy who was a youth minister for several years, I can tell you, even the congregation that we have now, every congregation I've been a part of has more active females in the youth group than it did males, at least that I've been a part of. And so now, again, with youth ministry, some of that can just be luck of the draw in a lot of ways. But there are other times where it's, you've got, if you've got 6 people that sign up to go on a trip, the first 4 names on there are going to be the 4 girls, as opposed to the 2 guys. They need a little bit more coaxing. And so I think what we've noticed is because of the way culture has swung and because of the way the church reacts to it, young men specifically, have decided that, well, maybe it's best if I'm there, but I'm not on display. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with either of y'all as far as, we'll be there and kind of involved, but don't ask me to say anything out loud?
I've seen the experience. I don't know that I can identify exactly why that is, and maybe it is tied to this discussion, but I did youth ministry for 6 years, and I had a handful of guys through that time that were leaders that ended up becoming preachers and going into ministry. But if they didn't have that drive and desire, they wanted to fade to the background. They didn't want to be the face of anything. And maybe it's tied to this. We don't want to be known as zealots. We don't want to be known as the guy who sticks out and stands up and is the one that speaks. And so, since girls maybe articulate it better, they're a little more assertive in that way in that area, I'll just let them lead. And the church needs to fix that. That's where the church comes in. The church needs to empower them. We just had a lesson here at Bear Valley on Sunday morning. We've been in a leadership study, and Corey made the statement Sunday morning that leadership, training young men for leadership, is not about training them to lead a public prayer or lead a song. It's much deeper than that. And it's about having these characteristics that have the courage and the confidence to stand up and lead and say something, but we allow them to fade to the background. And then we expect them when they get to be 18 or 25 or 40 to come out of the shadows, and they've never done it. And we've failed in empowering them in that.
Absolutely.
I've been involved in youth work over the past 10 years. I've never been a youth minister, but the responsibilities of youth work tends to fall on me. I'm relatively younger than others in our congregation that might also have that responsibility, so it tends to fall on me. And so what I'm about to say is a observation. That's all it is. Okay. I observe that that youth ministry today in the church is geared more toward our young ladies than it is our young men. Now, hear me out. Women are naturally more community oriented, and they're naturally more emotionally oriented. And it seems to me that our youth groups are all about group activities in particular. Of course, you want everybody together and foster fellowship, of course, but group activities, which women, females tend to emphasize, and emotion. Guys, on the other hand, are individualistic in many respects, and we're not as emotionally thrusted as women. Now, when all of your devos are about, well, let's come together around the campfire and let's have this, heartfelt discussion where we want everybody crying. Well, your young men are not going to respond to that in the same way your young women are. So I think that is something to consider with youth ministry in particular, is how do we make this suitable to how God made these young men? And I find that, on the other hand, if we have a service project that we're doing, guys are the first ones to sign up. Girls will sign up too, especially if it's an emotionally driven, service project where you're serving soup at a soup kitchen or something like that. But if we're going to somebody's house to clean up after a tornado, or if we're going to go build something for somebody, our young ladies, of course, they enjoy that, and they sign up to do that. But our young men are really excited to do that. And so leadership, the best leadership is servant leadership. And I think what we've done is we have told our young men, through no fault of anyone necessarily, but we've told our young men, if you want to be a leader, it's about standing up in front of people and being the best at something. Here's your blue ribbon for being the best song leader or public speaker or whatever. And nothing, I don't mean that as an attack on any programs that do such, but it does build an ego.
Very quickly.
It does build an ego, but there's no service there. It's all about how the pats on the back after I get done, how many of those can I get, how wonderful I am. And there's no service there. But I find with our young men, they do want to serve. They really do want to serve. So,
well, it speaks to their identity. That's what God created them to be. And that the other issues may be beneficial, but it doesn't draw to what God instilled in them from creation. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to do a better job of broadening our ministries to match the needs that our young folks have, and our men as well. We don't even have, for older men, those opportunities in the church to exercise that masculinity. Again, most of our assemblies are they're about group activities. They're about emotionally driven thoughts. It's not about, let's go paint, this person's house. Let's go cut the grass. In fact, we almost relegate that to that special class of servants as deacons in the church. And if you look at most congregations, those are the most masculinely positive men in the congregation, because they're actively working and serving in a regular capacity.
No, I agree, and I think it speaks to the problem that she really gets at in the video. And to oversimplify her I guess complaint, or the issue that she perceives, something that she's yearning for, is essentially, where have all the good men gone? When she says, she made the comment, I think her words were, when she looks around on Sunday mornings, it's pretty dry as far as young Christian men who are willing to get up and stand. And so, Joshua, you and I don't know if we've ever done this on the podcast, but you and I know have had conversations about it's our personal belief, and I'll let Wayne chime in if he wants to. Our personal belief is one of the most forefront issues in the church today is a lack of strong male leadership within congregations. And that's not necessarily an attack on the church as a whole, but for whatever reason, and I don't know if we want to point to a specific generation, or even if we can, but Wayne, kind of like what you mentioned, we have created a culture where maybe through the difference between youth ministry versus being a part of the body, or just focusing on men in general, we got to a point where at 18, you were just kind of expected to start doing stuff, and you were expected to know how to start doing stuff. At 25, 28, you were expected to volunteer to teach Bible class, regardless of whether or not you had ever been taught how to do so, or you had ever watched somebody do so. You were expected that, pet peeve of mine, but you were expected that if you're in your mid 30s and you've got a couple of 2-year-olds at home, you were expected to be a deacon, because you were qualified. And I put that in air quotes for anybody that's not watching the actual video. But and so we just kind of expect these things, and somewhere along the line, in the culture of the church, a couple of, or maybe a lot of men said, I don't want to do that. I don't know how to do that. And so therefore I'm just not going to do it. And I think that there's a big problem with a lack of male leadership. In fact, that there's and I say that that's a problem because it's one that I want to be very compassionate toward and very empathetic toward, because as a youth minister specifically, those are hard conversations to have with your young female students who have a desire and a gift to serve in some of these capacities that God has said that's outside of the realm of purview that I've given to you. And when you have a young lady that says, yeah, but I want to, I'm able to, and I could be good at it, and there are no men to do it anyway, those are hard conversations to have. And I use that term from a youth ministry perspective, but I've sat in Bible classes with 40, 50-year-old women who have made the comment that it's hard when they see a lack of men willing to lead when they know they could, quote unquote, do it better. And so there's a whole nother issue there, maybe, that, do it better according to who. But I think that I want to be a little bit empathetic to the idea that I think that there are women in congregations all over that are seeking to serve, and it maybe hurts them. I say maybe, it definitely hurts them when they look around and there are not men willing to get up and lead in certain capacities. So that I think is the big problem that I think she's observing, and is kind of questioning and wants to know why that is, and maybe even so how to fix it. But we'll get to that in a minute. So.
Well, I'll say again, like you said earlier, to be fair to both sides, and again, I don't know her, and it's a 1-minute clip, so you have to read into certain things. But finding a man who will lead doesn't mean finding a man who will lead a prayer in a public assembly.
Sure,
he may not have been taught to do that. He may have a work ethic. He may have a desire and a goal. I'll share a short story. Our second daughter got married to a guy just a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago. He's 7 years older than her, and he's an elder son where I used to preach in Texas. Phenomenal young man, grown man. But he was living, he would go to college for a semester and he would lay out. He'd live at home. And when she first started having interest in him, she told us, and I can say this now, said he's a bum. He lives at home. He's not finished college. Well, then when she got to meet him and know him more and talk, he was working to save for the next semester of college. And then he would pay for that semester of college so he could graduate with no debt. And his parents had told him, as long as you're working towards your degree, you can live here. The minute he got his degree, he moved out, got an apartment. It was a work ethic like she had really never seen in a Christian young man before. The vision to look ahead. And so maybe we're looking too much at the public view of leadership and of masculinity, and not the personal traits and qualities. You may not find a guy who likes to preach and likes to lead singing and likes to lead prayers publicly, but he may be the man just like God created Adam to be in the garden. You just got to give him a chance to exhibit those traits in other areas of life,
and not to necessarily to ruin anything as far as the perspective of this young woman. But as you go through and you watch some of her videos, one of her videos that she actually posted, it was probably 8 months or so after the video that we're talking about right now. She's actually currently engaged. And made a video about the young man that she's engaged to, and she talked about how great of a man he was. And one of the captions of that video was about his faithfulness. And I think that maybe is a characteristic of male leadership that is maybe underutilized or underemphasized, I guess is a better word, is the faithfulness that a man has, not just to their spouse or their significant other, but to Christ, which I think is another layer of this conversation. But when I completely agree, I think sometimes we mistake leadership, and we mistake leadership as things that are visible.
Yep.
And whereas I want to be careful when I say that, just because there are times where it is visible if a man is a father or a good husband. A lot of those things that make a man a good husband or whatnot, oftentimes we don't get to see in short 30-minute to an hour interactions on Sunday mornings or Wednesday nights.
Yeah, I would also add to that, going back to our previous conversation about culture. Church has a culture, and for whatever reason, over the past 25 years, um, the stereotype of young Christian man is a guy who wears an untucked flannel shirt with skinny jeans and like hasn't showered or shaved in 5 months. And I don't want somebody like that necessarily. Not to judge a book by its cover, but when the cover says what it says, you got to take the cover into consideration. Like I think that's what she means when she goes to church and she sees that it's dry. It's not that there aren't Christian men; it's that there are Christian men who look like bums and they're puny. And you know these young ladies who are looking for husbands, Christian husbands, they want someone who's going to take charge. There was a study done for the 4 needs of men and 4 needs of women in marriage, and one of the needs of women, I think it's number 3. Well, actually, let's start with number 1 is for love and acceptance and security. Well, you're not going to get that from this puny guy who has jeans tighter than yours. I mean, sorry to capitalize on skinny jeans, but there's something about it. I don't understand it. So
coming from the thinnest guy in the room, that's funny. But
I don't wear skinny jeans. I'll tell you that right now.
I don't have the temptation or the problem. So
no, me either. So if you take nothing else from the podcast, guys, leave the skinny jeans on the shelf. I think that's the moral of our story. But I also think too that we've demonized not just masculinity, but the idea of dating and dating for finding a guy that is suitable. I mean, back to Wayne's story about your daughter and now son-in-law. If that idea of him being a bum would have persisted, they probably wouldn't have got married.
Yep.
I have a cousin who she has a teenage daughter now who is starting to date, and she asked publicly on Facebook for dating advice. And there's 49 comments on this post, and all of them are you need to go on the dates with them. You need to have a curfew. You need to supervise, and you need to look at their text messages every day. And you know what? To each their own. You have to, as a parent, obviously figure out. And I'm not saying that those are bad suggestions, but every one of those comments demonized the young man. And I don't know the young man. I don't know. He might be a heathen. He might be terrible. He might be the devil in human clothing. I don't know. But for what it's worth, my advice was encourage dating, welcome the young man into your family. You never know what impact you can have on him and he could have on you. And, don't think that all young men are the devil. There are some really good, godly young men in this world who take God seriously, who take his word seriously. And I think we may be accepting of that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it just goes to show. This is a shameless self plug, by the way. If you want a much longer conversation around that, there's a podcast that we did with a guy named Corey on practicing divorce and whether or not dating today is more along the lines of practicing divorce as opposed to dating with intention. But I think you're right, Joshua, that there are absolutely realms of which that we tend to think the worst of young men before we've ever actually given them a chance. And I think that's back to maybe one of the original thoughts of the podcast was that's a pretty reactionary response. that culture has told us repeatedly, hey, you need to be on the lookout because all guys are only after. I mean, how many of us have heard that growing up in our lives that all teenage guys are only after one thing? Wayne, I think you have 4 daughters, right? I mean, so like Wayne understands that there's a certain amount of caution that comes from having a young man come over who's interested in your daughter. And so I think Wayne would say that he's lucky enough to have found, I think maybe 3 and possibly now 4.
Two
Two.
son-in-laws, one soon to be. Garrett Bailey will be married in May, and hopefully Carson will stay single a little while longer. She
Gotcha.
just
Okay.
turned 16, so I
Gotcha.
hope.
Okay.
I hope.
So I couldn't remember exactly where everybody fell
Yeah.
in that line, but I think that that speaks to this identity of what biblical masculinity is supposed to look like. And so if the problem is that there's a lack of male leadership that exists within the church or exists within the family or just society as a whole, I think the next logical question becomes, well, what do we do to fix it? How do we take steps to make sure that it is it's going to be better moving forward? And I have 3 things, one of which I'll be totally honest, I stole from Wayne. But one of the things is that there needs to be a sense of urgency around it. That's been the last at least 2 episodes of Authentically Adam, is that there has to be a sense of urgency that I made it a priority when I was in youth ministry to try to iterate to the elders that I worked for that 15, 16-year-old students, period, men or women, that are never taught how to teach a Bible class, become 25, 26-year-old young adults who refuse to teach a Bible class. And I know that, not to step on our point about how leadership goes beyond the class, but from a training youth ministry future church leader perspective, we've got to train people. We've got to teach them, show them how to work and how to live and what to prioritize. And we need to have a sense of urgency enough to do it sooner rather than later. And so there's a plug. I'll link Wayne. We keep talking about it. I'll link Wayne's podcast below, by the way, and all these descriptions of Authentically Adam. Those last 2 episodes were fantastic about the urgency that's needed to instill some of these things. But I think that there's a sense of urgency that needs to happen. I think that we don't need to be ashamed of what masculinity is and how the Bible defines it. And then I think that there's a balance that needs to take place. And I'll let you all elaborate on these things as you want. But the balance that needs to take place is, because I've talked with several dads who are trying to find the balance of pushing their sons to be the leader and to participate in the way that they want them to, versus pushing them too hard to the extent where they reject it all outright. And I've had several conversations with dads as a youth minister. I've had conversations with dads that I'm friends with who have said, if I keep pushing my son to do the things that I want him to do, I'm afraid that he's going to just give it all up outright. And so I think that there's a balance that needs to take place there too. But those are the 3 that I came up with. Feel free to add, take away, or disagree by any stretch.
I came up with a handful. I'll mention a couple. I think we need to account for the maturity gap between generations and respect that. I don't think, just based on society and the way things go, I don't think that young men grow up today as fast as they used to. And so I think that, and maybe we can change that, and that's another conversation, but we are where we are. We get guys come to Bear Valley at 18, 19 years old who've never had a full-time job.
Mm.
They've a lot of them have been homeschooled, so there hasn't been the interaction in the world, and they're exposed to things for the first time. And again, to each his own. And we've homeschooled our girls. That's just a personal preference. It's not a mandate by any stretch. But you've got to account for the fact that an 18-year-old today is not what an 18-year-old was 20 years ago. And so the expectation they're going to be something different is just not fair. And I think dads have to adjust to that. I mean, when I had a job when I was 15, and I worked every weekend with my granddad delivering milk in North Mississippi, and it just, that was life. My dad talked about, though, he laid sod, so my job was much easier than his was at 15. Yeah. So that generation gap changed. Well, now my girls, they had jobs because they wanted a car, and that was our rule. You had to have a job if you want a car. But some families don't have that. And so you've got to account for the generation gap. And I think that you've got to model the Titus 2 approach in the congregation. You've got to get young men with older men one-on-one. You've got to get them serving together and eating together. When I was in the youth ministry position or associate position I was in, it was my third preaching work, but I was only 21, 22 years old at that point in time. And there's a man whose wife passed away, and he and I went to lunch every day for almost 6 years. And he changed my life. He was not a preacher. He was not an elder. But he taught me how to be a man. We lost him a few years ago, but he changed my life. And it was a Titus 2 moment for me. It was an older man teaching a young man, even though I was in a position of potential leadership over him as a minister and a preacher. He took me under his wing. And if we did that in the church, we would close that generation gap easier, and we would raise more leaders. We would.
The only thing I have to add to any of what you both have said, which I think you're both absolutely right, is in Ephesians 5, I know the context there is husbands and wives, but God tells husbands to do the single hardest thing for a man to do, and that is to love and to show that sort of emotional, softer side that we often bury within ourselves. And he asks the women, the wives, to do the single hardest thing for them, which is to submit to the headship of their husbands. And I don't think it should be lost on us that biblical insert role here, whether it's biblical femininity, biblical masculinity, whatever, is always challenging because it is typically anti-cultural, and as is so true of so many facets of the Christian life. It goes against everything we know. It goes against what society tells us. It goes against what we want. And as is always the case, our job is to submit to the headship of Christ and to submit to how he would have us be as his people. And so I think if we remember that and we accept the challenge, then we can move on fulfilling that.
No, I completely agree. And I think that, Joshua, I think that's a key component. I think sometimes we get carried away and we have these conversations. Not that it's necessarily easy for the three of us, but I think it may be easier for the three of us, having done it for longer than maybe some of the high school guys that we're talking about. Or, let's not forget about maybe guys that come to know Christ in their 20s or 30s or so on and so forth. What you're asking somebody to do is not just love your wife better, but to do one of the harder things that you're asked to do. That kind of goes against maybe some of the inclinations that you have.
Well, you and I, Nathan, are in a transition now where
Sure.
we have been mentored our entire life, and now we're in a stage of life in our early 30s, late 20s, where we're mentoring other young men. And, I learned a long time ago that none of us know what in the world we're doing. We're all trying to navigate this sea of life as best we can. But there's responsibility with that comes.
I appreciate you giving me credit for being in my late 20s, by the way. That was very thoughtful of you. Even though I'm not,
I noticed I got left out of that comparison.
So Joshua, this brings me to a really good point, though, because that transition is something that I was going to add on to maybe what Wayne said. And this is just a personal challenge that I give. We can disagree about this if you want. I'm perfectly content with that. But a challenge that I give and always have to some extent is, and it's a little harder when you're young. And as you get older, maybe you get a little bit more weight to carry some of this stuff because you get to more so lead by example. But Josh, you talk about the transition that we have of where, we've got our mentors and now they're young men who maybe are looking to us. Back to Wayne's point of Titus 2, it's the older men that have to take that first step. There's a constant, and this is just my observation, I'm not talking about any place in particular, but there is a constant battle within church culture that says the young adults say, well, we want this, and the older adults say, well, we want this, and we'll do it if you'll do it, and you guys have to take the first step versus you. If we could put all that stuff aside, and I, like I said, for me, maybe, and maybe people don't like this because I'm Joshua, you and I are in that phase. Wayne, I don't know where you are. I'm just being honest. But Joshua and I are in that phase where we're still too young to be old, but we're way too old to be young. And I'm not going to use the phrase middle aged because I refuse to believe that we're a part of that category. But it's on older men and women even to help nurture and mentor the younger generation, because whether there's a maturity gap there or not, the younger people are not going to step forward first. It's just not in their nature. It's an intimidating aspect about them. And so I always lay, and that includes myself, I lay the charge squarely on those that are older, that have been there, that have done it, that know enough. They don't know it all, Joshua. Nobody knows it all, right? But we know just enough to pass on what we do know. And I think that there's got to be an effort that takes place in that regard. Anything else, guys? I mean, I'm super thankful that we're able to have this conversation.
Me too.
Yeah. So it's a problem, but I don't want us to paint a picture that it's a lost cause either. I think that it's always encouraging. That I'll give you an example. Horizons. If anybody knows what Horizons is at Freed-Hardeman University, it started as a future leadership camp, and they still have that ability. This past summer, 2023 was the first year in that probably 20 plus, since it maybe was a male only camp, was the first year in over a decade that the male slots filled up before the female slots filled up to go to camp, which was kind of telling to me in a lot of ways. I don't want this to come off as though this is a lost cause, that the church is doomed and has no future leadership, but there is a sense of urgency that needs to take place. And so I do think that there are absolutely solutions and steps that we can take. And I hope that we all are encouraged to do so through this or a variety of other resources, bar none being, top of the list scripture. And so
it just takes
Josh,
a one-on-one approach. It takes investing, just one guy at a time, one relationship at a time. And it'll change. And it is in a lot of places. It's not dire in every situation, but I feel for those ladies that are in the situation that young lady was in, when she looks and looks and looks and can't find. So
sure.
we can be the solution to that if we'll just be intentional.
Yeah,
100%.
I agree with Nathan. I don't. There are a lot of things in the church that are going downhill rapidly. If we're being completely honest, there are a lot of things that really need fixing. This is the one topic that, in my observation, is actually improving as time goes on. I am seeing more young men excited about the church. I'm seeing more young men who want to be involved in the church, and I hope that continues.
Absolutely. Well, guys, thank you so much for being on, Wayne. We are sincerely appreciative of your time. You're going to
Can I
say
add one thing?
Absolutely.
I'm looking out my window and it is snowing like crazy in Colorado right now. It was not in the forecast. I noticed something moving in the blinds and think, no way. The parking lot is totally covered at the school right now. So anyway,
that's fantastic. What's
that's
funny
why I love this place. That is
I was going to say, what's funny is there's every possibility that you'll go out at 3:00 this afternoon and it'll all be gone.
Yep.
So
Yep.
depending on how the rest of the day progresses. But Wayne, thank you so much for being on, man. We sincerely appreciate your time. As always, if you've got questions, comments, concerns, hopes, dreams, emotional outbursts, reach out to us. We're here to talk about any and all of it. So if you've got videos you want us to talk about, be sure to send those to myself or Joshua. If you're looking for a church home, I'm at the Troy Church of Christ in West Tennessee. Joshua's at the Salem Creek Church of Christ in Middle Tennessee. Wayne is at the Bear Valley Church of Christ in Denver, Colorado. So if you happen to be out in that area, they great group of men at Bear Valley Church, as well as the Institute out there, that would be more than happy to help you with any sort of questions that you have. But until next time, guys, thank you so much for listening.